Is that she's going to play her butt off, man. She's going to compete. Nobody's going to go walking in for a layup. And so I don't oppose the hard foul, but I also don't think that she intentionally went for the net.
She absolutely went for the net. I mean, this is some stuff that I've watched my entire life. She absolutely did. And she wasn't going for the ball when she took her backhand and went around the neck. Now, if you think otherwise, you're stupid.
A coach defends the opponent. A coach minimizes the contact on her own player. A coach sounds more interested in explaining the other team's intensity than protecting her star. These moments usually don't happen. Coaches operate under an unwritten rule. When your player gets hit, you defend your player. You don't need to lie. You don't need to throw the opponent under the bus. But you make it clear where your loyalty stands.
Certain situations, I think it's really easy, and especially for young people or for those who aren't in it every day, to react to everything that happens. It's also
Stephanie White didn't follow that playbook. After Sophie Cunningham got fouled hard by DeJonai Carrington, after the contact was violent enough to draw an ejection, White walked to the podium and started explaining why Carrington competes so hard. She talked about how nobody gets an easy layup. She talked about how she doesn't oppose the hard foul. And somewhere in that answer, the Indiana Fever fan base decided they'd seen enough. This wasn't just about one foul. It was about a pattern. It was about a coach who kept choosing the wrong moment to be philosophical. And it sparked a conversation that's still happening because the real issue isn't what Stephanie White said about basketball. It's what she didn't say about her own team. The controversy didn't start with malice. It started with a basketball play that crossed a line. DeJonai Carrington fouled Sophie Cunningham in a way that warranted an ejection. It was the kind of contact that makes you wince when you see it, the kind that leaves marks, the kind that gets players and coaches heated immediately after it happens. The Fever locker room felt it. The players understood what they'd just witnessed. And then Stephanie White walked into the post-game press conference, and something went sideways. When journalists asked about the foul, White didn't lead with concern for her player. She didn't say Sophie was okay, and they expected her to be protected. Instead, she led with context about Carrington. She explained that Nalissa competes hard. She explained that nobody's going to walk in for an uncontested layup. She explained her philosophy on hard fouls. Only after building that frame did she address the specific play. And when she did, she said she didn't believe Carrington intentionally went for the neck. Now that statement matters. There's a real difference between reckless and intentional. A foul can be excessive enough to warrant an ejection without being premeditated. From a pure basketball analysis standpoint, White was making a legitimate point. She was distinguishing between playing physical defense and deliberately trying to hurt someone. That distinction matters in locker rooms. It matters between coaches. It matters if you're trying to understand the difference between a dangerous play and a malicious one. But here's where it gets complicated. Coaching isn't just about being right. It's about communicating in ways that land with the people listening. And when you're the head coach of a team, the people listening include your own players first. Sophie Cunningham had just taken a hard foul. She was the one dealing with the physical impact. She was the one who might be sore tomorrow. And the first thing her head coach did publicly was explain the other team's perspective. Fans started noticing a pattern. This wasn't the first time White had sounded more interested in explaining an opponent than defending her own player. When Caitlin Clark had gotten hit or fouled, White had used similar language. She talked about the game being physical. She talked about respecting opponent intensity. She talked about the difficulty of officiating. And each time, something felt off to the people watching. The logic was sound, but the priorities seemed backwards. The criticism that followed wasn't subtle. Commentators went on air and said White had embarrassed her own players. Fans filled social media with arguments that a coach's job, especially a head coach of a star player, includes protecting those players publicly, regardless of whether she agrees with every judgment. They pointed out that when quarterbacks get hit late in football, coaches defend the quarterback. When stars get fouled hard in basketball, teammates and coaches usually send a message. We saw it, we didn't like it, and we're protecting our own. What made this moment significant wasn't just the content of White's answer. It was the sequencing. She led with Carrington's perspective. She led with the philosophy of hard fouls. She led with context about intensity. And only after establishing all of that did she address Sophie. From a listener's perspective, that ordering communicated something. It communicated that understanding the opponent was more important than defending the player.
Or the hard foul the other night. What have you as a coach and this team learned about limiting distractions and just focusing on ball this season?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're not going to ever minimize it. Nothing that any one of us does is ever going to be we're going to please everyone all the time. I hope that the biggest thing that we learn is how to be responsive instead of reactive.
Learn how to be responsive instead of...
It communicated that philosophy mattered more than loyalty. It communicated that the head coach's first instinct was to be fair to everyone, which sounds noble until you realize that fair can also mean detached. The Fever fan base had already been through a lot. They'd watched their franchise become one of the most scrutinized organizations in sports overnight. Caitlin Clark changed everything about the scale of attention. Every game mattered nationally. Every foul became a national debate. Every post-game quote got clipped, reposted, and weaponized across social media. In that environment, the fan base wanted to feel like their team's leadership understood what was happening. They wanted to feel like their coach saw the same thing they saw when Sophie got hit. They wanted unmistakable loyalty.
White spoke to the media, and to say some of her statements were disgusting would be an understatement. It would be an understatement. Her still refusing to acknowledge the fact that, yeah, I should have stood up for my players, not DeJonai Carrington in that moment. I should have stood up for Caitlin Clark, who was the real victim, not Alyssa Thomas in that moment. This lady still clearly don't get it. This lady don't get it, and she never, ever, ever.
What they heard instead was nuance. And nuance, no matter how accurate, can feel like a betrayal when you're looking for certainty. White wasn't wrong about Carrington's competitive nature. She wasn't wrong about the distinction between reckless and intentional. But in that moment, with her own player on the receiving end of a hard foul, the fan base didn't want a philosophy lecture. They wanted leadership that sounded like it had their back. They wanted a coach who understood that some moments demand you pick a side, even if you're picking a side about how you perceive something, not about what you believe the opponent meant to do. And that gap between what White said and what people needed to hear became the entire controversy. Let's be completely clear about something. Stephanie White's basketball analysis wasn't stupid. It wasn't wrong. It was actually technically sound, which is what makes this situation so interesting. Because the real problem wasn't her reasoning. The real problem was that she delivered perfect basketball logic in a moment that required a different kind of leadership. When White said she didn't think Carrington intentionally went for Sophie's neck, she was making a distinction that matters in the game. In basketball, especially at the professional level, there's a real difference between playing physical defense and committing a flagrant or dirty foul with intent to injure. A player can commit a reckless foul, one that crosses the line and warrants an ejection, without having actually planned to hurt someone beforehand. Those aren't the same things. A flagrant foul can be called based on excessive contact without requiring proof of premeditation. That's why officials have the judgment to eject players for plays that were genuinely careless rather than genuinely malicious. White understood that distinction. She was probably trying to protect Carrington from having her character questioned. She was probably trying to establish that playing physical defense is part of women's basketball and shouldn't be demonized as long as it doesn't cross into dirty play.
She went out of her way to defend DeJonai Carrington for a foul on her own player. This is how stupid this woman is and how whacked out this league is. Here you go, Stephanie White.
One of the things about Nay is that she's going to play her butt off, man. She's going to compete. Nobody's going to go walking in for a layup. And so I don't oppose the hard foul. But I also don't think that...
Those are reasonable coaching positions. In a film session with her own team, that's exactly the kind of nuance that matters. You can tell your players that opponents are going to be physical, that physicality is part of the game, that you don't fault someone for playing hard. That message keeps your team from overreacting, keeps them focused on basketball rather than getting into extended feuds with opponents. But here's where the nuance trap catches coaches. Nuance works great when you're explaining things internally, when you're managing your own locker room's emotions, when you're trying to keep your players from doing something stupid. Nuance becomes a trap when you're the public voice of the organization during a moment of controversy. Because in that moment, people aren't parsing your basketball analysis. They're reading your priorities. And priorities, unlike basketball logic, are simple things. They're not complicated. They're not full of distinctions. They're just about where someone's loyalty stands. When White said she doesn't oppose hard fouls, she was probably being accurate about her philosophy. Most coaches accept that professional women's basketball is physical. They accept that defenders are going to make contact. They accept that the game has changed and players aren't going to give up layups just to avoid contact. That's all true. But when you're the head coach of a player who just got fouled hard enough to get the fouler ejected, and your first public statement emphasizes that you accept hard fouls, the message people hear isn't about basketball philosophy. The message is that you're okay with what happened to your player. This is where White's biggest vulnerability shows up. She's trying to be fair to both sides. She's trying to be reasonable about the game. She's trying to be the adult in the room who doesn't overreact to every controversial play. And in normal circumstances, that's actually good coaching. That's the kind of restraint that keeps teams from spiraling into emotional chaos after every foul. That's the kind of perspective that helps young players understand the difference between getting knocked down and getting wronged. But the circumstances around the Fever aren't normal anymore, because Caitlin Clark changed the entire media ecosystem around this franchise. Every play gets magnified. Every quote gets analyzed. Every controversial moment becomes a referendum on the organization. In that environment, trying to be fair to everyone is actually a luxury that White can't afford. Because when you're trying to be fair to the opponent, people watching are reading it as you choosing the opponent over your player. That's not fair to White, but it's how perception works. The real trap is that nuance requires trust, and trust is something you have to build over time with consistent behavior. If White had spent her first season as Indiana's head coach establishing crystal clear loyalty to her players, then came out with nuanced takes on controversial plays, people would trust that she had Sophie's back even when she was being analytical about Carrington. But White has spent her early tenure with the Fever sounding more interested in explaining opponents than defending her own team. So when she tried to be nuanced about this foul, it didn't land as measured reasoning. It landed as more of the same pattern. The tragedy is that White's basketball thinking is probably correct. Carrington probably wasn't trying to injure Cunningham. The play was probably reckless rather than malicious. And in a vacuum, those are important distinctions. But coaching doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in an environment where perception shapes everything. And in that environment, the most correct basketball analysis is still the wrong answer if it's the wrong message. There's a concept in communication called the primacy effect. Essentially, the first things you say have disproportionate weight in how people understand everything that follows. It's the reason opening statements in trials matter so much. It's the reason the beginning of a pitch determines whether investors listen to the rest. It's the reason the first sentence of a story hooks you before you even know what the story is about. And it's exactly why the way Stephanie White sequenced her post-game answer created such a massive problem. Think about what White did. She started by talking about how Nalissa competes hard. She established that Nalissa is going to play her butt off, as she said. She set the tone that nobody's going to get an uncontested layup. She created a frame where aggressive defense is a value, where physicality is expected, where intensity is something she respects. Only after building that entire architecture did she address the specific play. Only after establishing all of that context did she say she doesn't think Carrington intentionally went for the neck. From a pure communication standpoint, that's backwards. If you want people to understand that you have your own players back, you start there. You start with Sophie. You start with concern. You start with the expectation that your player will be protected. You can absolutely follow that with nuance. You can absolutely explain that Carrington plays hard. You can absolutely establish that you don't think the contact was premeditated. But you do that second. You do that after you've made it clear where you stand. The way White sequenced it sent a different message entirely. Because when you lead with the opponent's perspective, you're telling the world what you prioritize. You're saying that understanding Carrington's intensity matters more to you right now than addressing what happened to Cunningham. You're saying that the offensive perspective is more important than the defensive one. You're establishing a hierarchy where the coach's philosophy about hard fouls ranks above immediate concern for her own player. And here's where it gets worse. When people are trying to read intentions, they look at what comes first. They look at what someone emphasizes. They look at what someone chooses to spend time explaining. If White had opened with "Sophie took a hard foul," we don't think it was intentional, but we expect our players to be protected, and I respect how Carrington competes. That's a completely different message. All the same information is there. All the same nuance exists, but the priority is clear. Instead, White spent most of her explanation talking about Carrington before she got to Sophie. And when you do that, when you spend more time explaining one side than the other, you're communicating something about what matters to you. People are reading between the lines because coaches usually don't talk about the opponent that much when their own player has just been fouled. Most coaches, when their player gets hit, immediately defend the player and only address the opponent if they absolutely have to. This is where the comparison to other sports becomes relevant. In football, when a quarterback gets hit late and it's flagged for roughing the passer, the coach usually doesn't spend the post-game presser explaining how the defensive end plays hard and nobody gets an easy completion. The coach says the hit was late, the rule exists to protect the quarterback, and his player took unnecessary contact. That's the hierarchy. The player comes first. The opponent's perspective comes later, if at all. White inverted that hierarchy. And because she inverted it, people started wondering whether it was intentional. Did White do it on purpose to downplay the foul? Or did she just not realize how it would land? Either way, the effect was the same. By the time she got around to saying she doesn't think Carrington intentionally targeted Sophie's neck, people had already established a perception. They'd already decided what her real priority was based on what she chose to emphasize first. This matters because it's a trap that's easy to fall into when you're trying to be thoughtful and comprehensive. When you're a coach who values understanding the game from multiple angles, it's natural to want to explain all those angles. It's natural to lead with the context about physicality. It's natural to establish your philosophy. But what's natural for a coach thinking through basketball problems isn't necessarily what works for a public leader trying to communicate loyalty. The real lesson here is that sequencing is part of the message. It's not just what you say. It's what you say first, what you say second, what you emphasize, what you linger on. When you understand that, you understand why people were upset, because they weren't just reading White's words. They were reading the order of her words. And the order told a story about where the head coach's priorities stood. And in that story, her own player came second. Here's where the argument gets genuinely complicated. Because Stephanie White might be right about the internal dynamics while still being wrong about the public messaging. Those aren't mutually exclusive. A coach can have a fully connected locker room and still communicate poorly to the outside world. A coach can know that her players have her back and still fail to make that clear to the fan base. Those are two different things, and the Fever situation involves both. White defended her approach by saying the locker room is good. She said the vibes are always pretty good. She said her players do a good job of keeping the main thing, and she might be completely right about that. There's no evidence from any of the Fever players publicly that anyone in the locker room thinks Stephanie White doesn't have their back. Caitlin Clark hasn't said it. Sophie Cunningham hasn't said it. Kelsey Mitchell hasn't said it. Aaliyah Boston hasn't said it. From everything we can see, the internal dynamic is fine. That's actually really important because it means this isn't necessarily a locker room crisis. The controversy didn't fracture the team. It didn't create division between White and her players. If anything, the players seem to understand that White is just trying to manage the information environment around a high-pressure situation. They probably get that she's trying to keep the noise from becoming a distraction. They probably appreciate that she's not trying to stoke fires or create extended feuds with opponents. From the inside, her philosophy probably makes a lot of sense. But coaching isn't only about what happens inside the locker room. That's an important part, but it's not the only part. Because a head coach is also the public representative of the organization. She's the voice that speaks to the media. She's the person who sets the tone for how the franchise responds to controversies. She's the one who gets to define what the team stands for in moments when definition matters most. And those external responsibilities don't disappear just because the internal dynamic is healthy. Think about it this way. The Fever could have perfect chemistry in the locker room and still lose the trust of their fan base if the public messaging is consistently confusing. The two things operate on different frequencies. Internally, White can establish loyalty through tone, through how she treats players in private, through how she defends them behind closed doors. Externally, she has to establish loyalty through clarity, through what she prioritizes in public statements, through how she sequences her messages. The problem White faces is that the external world is amplified now. Because of Caitlin Clark, because of the national attention, because of the scale of scrutiny around this franchise, what the coach says publicly gets analyzed with more intensity than ever before. In a small market situation, a coach could probably get away with a more philosophical tone in press conferences. The games would speak for themselves. The internal team dynamics would be what people cared about. But Indiana isn't a small market situation anymore. The cameras are watching. The social media is dissecting. The national audience is parsing every statement. And when that's the environment, a coach has to understand that public ambiguity creates space for everyone else to tell the story. When White doesn't clearly defend her own players, other people rush in to interpret her silence. Commentators fill the void. Fans fill the void. The narrative gets written by everyone except the person who actually knows what's happening. That's what happened here. Because White didn't send a crystal clear message about having Sophie's back, everyone else got to decide what her actual priorities were. The key insight is that locker room loyalty and public leadership are different things. A coach can be completely loyal to her players internally while failing to communicate that loyalty externally. And in the current environment around the Fever, external communication is actually more important than it might be on other teams, because the players are already carrying different kinds of pressure. Clark is dealing with superstar scrutiny. Cunningham is dealing with attention for her physical play and her willingness to speak publicly. Mitchell is balancing being an elite scorer while sharing the spotlight. Boston is adapting to how the roster's offensive identity has changed. When you have that many moving parts, that many narratives, that much external pressure, the coach becomes the stabilizer. The coach is supposed to absorb pressure so the players don't have to carry it all. The coach is supposed to communicate clarity so nobody outside the building can confuse the players about where the organization stands. That's where White is vulnerable. Not because she doesn't have her players' backs internally, but because she hasn't made that clear publicly. And in this environment, public clarity is part of the job. There's an unwritten rule in sports coaching that goes back generations. When your player gets hit, you defend your player. Not in a dishonest way, not by lying about what happened, not by claiming your opponent was trying to do something you don't believe, but you make it clear whose side you're on. You absorb the pressure. You take the conflict so your players don't have to. That standard exists across every level of sport because it works. It creates trust. It creates stability. It tells players that the organization will protect them. Dan Dakich, when he went on air to criticize Stephanie White, was invoking that standard. His language was extreme. He called White's comments disgusting. He broadened his criticism to attack the entire league. He made insults that went way beyond what the available evidence supports. But underneath the inflammatory rhetoric, his basketball argument was simple. Coaches are supposed to defend their players. That expectation is deeply ingrained. It's not controversial. It's not a new idea. It's how the profession works. When a football team's quarterback gets hit late and the officials throw a flag, the coach doesn't defend the defensive end. The coach doesn't explain how the defense plays hard and nobody gets to sit in the pocket all day. The coach doesn't establish a philosophical frame where late hits are part of the game. The coach says the hit was late, the rule exists to protect his player, and he expects better going forward. That's the standard. That's what people expect from leadership. And that standard exists because it works. It aligns the locker room. It makes the organization's priorities clear. It tells players they're protected. The same principle applies in basketball, though Dakich may have overstated how absolute this rule is. Coaches do sometimes acknowledge that opponents play hard. Coaches do sometimes establish context about physicality. It's not unusual for a coach to be thoughtful about the game. But even thoughtful coaches usually lead with their player. Even philosophical coaches usually establish loyalty first, and they definitely don't spend more time explaining the opponent's perspective than addressing their own player's well-being. What makes White's approach unusual is the degree to which she leans into the opponent's perspective. It's not that she explains context. It's that she explains context before she defends her player. It's not that she's philosophical about the game. It's that her philosophy seems to take priority over immediate concern for the person on her roster. And when that happens repeatedly, patterns emerge. Dakic noticed the pattern. The fan base noticed the pattern. And patterns, once they're established, become the story. Now here's where it's important to be fair to White. Her approach might not be calculated. It might not be strategic in a negative way. It might just be her personality. Some coaches are naturally more analytical than emotional. Some coaches naturally reach for context and nuance. Some coaches genuinely believe that the best way to lead is to stay calm and rational and avoid reactivity. Those are legitimate coaching philosophies, but philosophy doesn't exist in a vacuum. Philosophy has to match the moment. And in this moment, with this team, with this amount of external pressure, that particular philosophy creates problems. The issue isn't that White needs to start lying. She doesn't need to pretend Carrington intentionally tried to hurt Sophie if she doesn't believe that. She doesn't need to throw opponents under the bus or become combative with critics. Those aren't the only options. There's a middle ground where a coach can be honest about her assessment of intent while still being unambiguously protective of her own player. A coach can say, "Sophie took contact that I didn't like. We don't think it was intentional, but we expect our players to be protected, and we respect how Carrington competes." All of those things can be true simultaneously. But the way White delivered her message didn't include that middle ground. She didn't start by defending Sophie. She didn't make Sophie the center of her concern. She made the broader basketball context the center, and that's where the disconnect happened. Because fans aren't grading whether White's basketball analysis is correct. They're grading whether her leadership sounds like it has their players back. They're evaluating whether the coach's first instinct is to protect her own team or to explain everyone else. The Dakic criticism, stripped of its extreme language, is actually pointing at something real. Coaches do typically protect their players. That's a standard in the profession. And White's repeated departures from that standard, even if they come from a place of thoughtfulness rather than disloyalty, create a perception problem. The perception is that she cares more about being fair to everyone than about being clearly loyal to her own team. And in the current environment, where the Fever are operating under intense scrutiny, that perception is a leadership vulnerability that's going to keep creating problems. To understand why Stephanie White's communication matters so much right now, you have to understand how much has changed for the Indiana Fever in a very short period of time. This franchise went from a rebuilding project that most people ignored to one of the most scrutinized organizations in American sports. That transformation happened in months, not years. And it happened because one player changed the entire scale of attention surrounding this team. Caitlin Clark does that. She attracts enormous audiences. She changes the media landscape around every organization she's part of. When Indiana drafted her, they didn't just add a really good basketball player. They added a fundamental shift in how the franchise operates. The arena is louder now. The ratings conversation is louder. The officiating conversation is louder. The narratives swirling around every player are more intense. The outside noise is exponentially bigger than it was before Clark arrived. That matters because it changes what coaching requires. In a normal environment, a coach can probably get away with a more philosophical tone in press conferences. The internal dynamics matter most. The games speak for themselves. The storylines develop naturally over a season. A coach has room to be contemplative, to establish nuance, to take time explaining her thought process. Most organizations operate that way. Most coaches operate that way. But the Fever don't have that luxury anymore, because every answer gets dissected. Every answer becomes content. Every answer can either calm the room or make the room louder. The team is operating in a high-frequency information environment where perception gets established quickly and changes slowly. In that environment, the coach's communication style matters more than it might on other teams. The coach's clarity matters more. The coach's ability to send unmistakable messages matters more. White's communication style probably worked fine before Clark arrived. It probably worked fine when this franchise was less visible. It probably worked fine when the team wasn't playing in front of national audiences. But those conditions have changed. The visibility has increased. The scrutiny has increased. The stakes have increased. And a coaching style that was fine in one environment can create problems in another environment. That's not a criticism of White. It's just a reality of how circumstances change what's required. Think about what opponents now understand. They understand that playing against Indiana means playing on a national stage. They understand that every foul becomes a national debate. They understand that Caitlin Clark bends defenses with her shooting range and passing gravity. They understand that making Clark uncomfortable can disrupt Indiana's rhythm. They understand that Sophie Cunningham is willing to answer physicality with physicality. They understand all of this, and they come into games knowing that the stakes are amplified. That means the Fever are going to see more physical basketball, not less. Opponents will test the boundaries. They'll try to disrupt. They'll try to get in Cunningham's space. They'll try to make Clark uncomfortable without getting ejected. Because opponents understand that you have to be physical to compete with elite guards. And the national stage only increases the incentive to try these things because every play gets maximum exposure. This is where White's communication becomes preparation for an environment she knows is coming. The Fever aren't going to be finished with controversy after Sophie's foul. There will be more controversial plays. There will be more controversial officiating decisions. There will be more moments where the coach has to respond to something controversial. And if the pattern continues, if the coach continues to sound more interested in explaining opponents than defending her own team, the friction with the fan base is only going to increase. The pressure cooker effect is real. When you operate in an environment with this much external pressure, every internal communication becomes external. Everything that happens in the locker room eventually leaks. Everything gets interpreted. Everything becomes part of the narrative. So a coach has to understand that her public statements are going to shape how her team is perceived for months or even years. White has established a pattern where she reaches for nuance at moments when clarity would be more valuable. That pattern is now being watched. It's being scrutinized. It's being evaluated every time a controversial play happens. And the cumulative effect is that people have started reading her statements through the lens of that pattern. So when she tries to be nuanced again, people interpret it through the framework they've already established. They assume she's going to defend the opponent. They assume she's going to minimize what happened to her own player, and they prepare to be frustrated. That's the pressure cooker effect. The environment has gotten so intense, the visibility has gotten so high, the scrutiny has gotten so detailed that a coach's communication style becomes subject to intense analysis. And once people start analyzing it closely, patterns emerge. And once patterns emerge, every new statement gets read through that framework. White is trapped in that dynamic now. And the only way out is to break the pattern. She has to communicate differently. She has to make her priorities unmistakably clear. Or the friction is going to keep defining this organization. Stephanie White has repeated a phrase several times in response to the criticism. She talks about being responsive instead of reactive. She says her team does a good job of responding rather than reacting. She says the group understands the difference between letting external noise make decisions for them versus making thoughtful, intentional decisions. The phrase sounds reasonable in isolation. Coaches preach emotional control constantly. The idea of responding calmly instead of reacting emotionally is a legitimate coaching principle. But here's where the messaging gap becomes a real problem. When White says responsive instead of reactive, people are interpreting it in different ways. And those different interpretations are causing the confusion. Because White appears to mean something like, "Do not let outside chaos control our locker room." That's a reasonable interpretation. That's good coaching. That says to the players, people on the internet are going to try to divide us, so we keep the noise outside and support each other inside. But her critics are interpreting the same phrase very differently. When they hear responsive instead of reactive, they're hearing, do not respond to our legitimate criticism. They're hearing, do not acknowledge that we have valid concerns about how you're communicating. They're hearing, stop questioning my approach. And because of the pattern that's been established, that interpretation has traction. Because White has already sounded more interested in explaining opponents than defending her own team. When she says to focus on the basketball and ignore the noise, people wonder what she's actually saying. That's the messaging gap. It's the space between what White intends and what people understand. And until she closes that gap, every new statement is going to reopen the same argument. Because people aren't just listening to her words. They're reading her words through the framework of the pattern they've already observed. So responsive versus reactive isn't actually being heard as a team discipline issue. It's being heard as a dismissal of legitimate criticism. The problem is that public ambiguity creates space for everyone else to tell the story. When a coach's messaging is unclear, or when it can be interpreted multiple ways, the people listening start filling in the gaps. They create narratives to explain what they think the coach really means. And once those narratives are established, they're really hard to displace. Commentators fill the void. Fans fill the void. Critics fill the void. And suddenly, the coach's actual intent doesn't matter anymore because everyone has already decided what she must mean. That's exactly what happened here. Because White didn't send a crystal clear message about having her players' backs, everyone else got to decide what her actual priorities were. Dakic decided she was defending opponents. Fans decided she didn't respect her own team. Critics decided she had lost focus on who she was supposed to be leading. And all of those interpretations have been validated in people's minds by the evidence of the pattern. So when White tries to explain that she's responsive and not reactive, people don't hear her explanation. They hear someone who isn't taking responsibility for the communication problem. This is where the distinction between internal and external leadership becomes crucial. Internally, White can manage these messages effectively. She can explain to her players that they need to focus on basketball and ignore the noise. She can have conversations with them about not letting outside criticism divide them. She can establish that understanding within the locker room. And if the locker room is actually as connected as she says, those messages probably land well internally. But externally, those same messages create confusion. Because from the outside, when a coach repeatedly sounds more interested in explaining opponents than defending her own team, and then tells people not to react to that pattern, it sounds like she's asking people not to notice the pattern. It sounds like she's telling people their concerns are invalid. It sounds like she's deflecting rather than addressing the real criticism. The real issue is that White has been trying to manage multiple audiences with the same message, and those audiences need different things. Her players need to understand that external noise shouldn't divide the locker room. That's a legitimate message. But her fan base needs to understand that the coach has their team's back. That's also a legitimate message. And you can't deliver both messages effectively if you're only using one phrase. You need to be more specific. You need to make both things clear. A coach can say, "Our players know I have their backs, and that's not going to change no matter what anyone says outside the organization." That addresses the fan base's concern directly. And then separately, you can say, "But we're not going to let every criticism dictate what we do. We're going to stay focused on basketball." Those are two different statements addressing two different audiences. But if you only say the second one, people only hear the dismissal. That's where White is stuck right now. She's been saying the second message without clearly establishing the first one. So everything she says gets interpreted as further evidence that she doesn't have her players' backs. And until she reverses that order, until she makes it unmistakably clear that she's with her players first, the criticism is going to keep coming back. Because perception, once it's established, doesn't change just because you explain your philosophy. Perception only changes when you change the behavior that created it. At some point, the Indiana Fever organization has to make a decision. They have to decide whether Stephanie White is the right coach for this moment or whether this team needs a completely different voice. And that decision can't be based just on one controversial answer or one press conference. It has to be based on a bigger evaluation. It has to consider basketball, leadership, development, communication, and whether her approach fits the environment the Fever are operating in. From a pure basketball standpoint, there are questions to ask about White's tenure. Is the team organized? Are rotations maximizing the roster? Are young players developing at the rate they should? Does the offense hold up late in games? Is the defense improving? Does White manage timeouts, matchups, substitutions, and late-game possessions at a championship level? Those are the kinds of questions that should ultimately determine whether Indiana believes she's the right coach. Because coaching isn't only about communication, it's also about basketball. But communication is part of that evaluation. And the timing makes it more important because the Fever are no longer building toward relevance. Relevance is already here. The franchise has championship-level attention before it has championship-level certainty. Every weakness gets magnified. Every strange substitution becomes a debate. Every controversial answer becomes a referendum on leadership. That's the burden created by having Caitlin Clark on the roster, and it's not Clark's fault. It's simply the reality of what she brings. More fans, more cameras, more criticism, more pressure, more expectations. That raises the standard for everybody around her, including the head coach. The question is whether White's communication style, regardless of how thoughtful or how well-intentioned, fits that environment. Some coaches genuinely hate the media management aspect of coaching. They want basketball to be basketball. They want to work their roster, develop their players, and let the game speak for themselves. Those impulses are understandable. But once your team becomes this visible, there's no going back to a small market level of scrutiny. The visibility is permanent. The attention is permanent. The expectation that the coach can communicate clearly during controversial moments is permanent. So the Fever have two basic options. Option 1 is to keep Stephanie White and tell her very clearly that her messaging has to improve. Not her basketball, not her character, her messaging. Because the communication problem is real and it's not going to fix itself. It's a pattern that has been established and validated by the evidence. If White is willing to change how she communicates in controversial moments, if she's willing to lead with loyalty to her own players, if she's willing to save her philosophical explanations for later, then maybe she's still the right coach. But if she's going to keep reaching for nuance at moments when the situation demands clarity, then the friction is only going to increase. Option 2 is to recognize that this pattern suggests a fundamental mismatch between White's coaching philosophy and what the Fever need right now. Because some coaches operate best in normal pressure environments. They thrive on building teams gradually, developing players, and letting circumstances develop naturally. And some coaches operate best in high-pressure environments. They thrive on clarity, on unmistakable communication, on the ability to absorb external pressure and shield their locker room from it. Those aren't better or worse coaches. They're just coaches who fit different situations. The Fever situation isn't normal. The pressure is permanent. The visibility is permanent. The expectation for clarity is permanent. That requires a particular kind of coach. It requires someone who can compartmentalize the media management, someone who can send unmistakable messages while still being thoughtful about the game, someone who can protect her players publicly while understanding nuance internally. That's not impossible, but it is a specific skill set. And if White doesn't have it, then maybe Indiana needs to find someone who does. Here's what we know: the locker room appears connected. The players seem to understand what White is trying to do. The internal dynamic seems fine. If the only problem was internal, there would be no problem. But the problem isn't internal. The problem is external. It's perception. It's messaging. It's the gap between what White intends and what people understand. And that's a coaching problem because coaching doesn't exist only in the locker room. Coaching also happens in the public sphere. If the Fever choose to keep White, they're betting that she can change how she communicates. They're betting that she can understand that this environment requires clarity above nuance. They're betting that she'll recognize that some moments demand picking a side, even if you're picking a side about how you perceive something, not about what you believe the opponent meant to do. Those are big bets, but they might be worth making if the rest of the coaching is really good. If the Fever choose to move on, they're betting that there's a coach out there who naturally communicates with the kind of clarity this situation requires. Someone who doesn't have to be told to defend her players first. Someone who understands the environment she's working in and adjusts her approach accordingly. That coach might be hard to find, but if White can't make the adjustment, the friction is only going to intensify as the season goes on. The real stakes are in what's coming next. Playoff basketball is emotional. Stars get hit. Coaches work officials. Players defend teammates. Narratives explode after games. The organization has to know who it is before those moments arrive. Because if White is still reaching for nuance in April and May, if she's still explaining opponents when her own player has just been fouled, then the controversy that started now is going to look like a small preview of what's coming. The Stephanie White controversy isn't really about one foul or one press conference. It's about a fundamental question. What does leadership look like when your team is operating under unprecedented pressure? White has chosen a philosophy of restraint, of nuance, of not feeding the outrage cycle. That's noble. It's thoughtful. It's probably better for the locker room than the alternative. But leadership isn't only about internal management. It's also about public clarity. It's about making sure the people following your team understand where you stand. And when a coach repeatedly sounds more interested in explaining opponents than defending her own players, people start wondering if that's actually where she stands. That perception might be unfair. That perception might be based on a misreading of her intentions. But perception is leadership. How people perceive your priorities is what shapes whether they trust you. The Fever have a window right now to define what this organization stands for. They can keep White and demand that her messaging changes. They can move on and find someone whose leadership style naturally fits this environment. Either way, they have to choose. Because the ambiguity, the gap between what White intends and what people understand, is only going to create more friction as the season goes on. What's your take? Does Stephanie White have the right approach, just communicated poorly? Or is this evidence of a fundamental mismatch between her coaching style and what the Fever actually need? Drop your thoughts in the comments.